an IRB review involving all cancer-relevant research involving human subjects conducted at the 5 Harvard clinical institutions. We're really pleased to have her here with us. Dr. Licholai teaches at Yale School of Management and is co-director of the Center for Digital Health. He's Chief Medical and Information Officer at PRA Health Sciences, a leading pharmaceutical service, health data, and contract research provider. Previously, he was president of the Rare Disease Division of Moderna Therapeutics, president and chief medical officer of Castle Creek Pharmaceuticals, and was a partner at McKinsey & Company, where he ran the healthcare data service line. He's also been an executive in various different roles, and on the faculty of the Yale School of Management, he teaches capstone lectures in healthcare and is co-director, again, of the Center for Digital Health at Yale. So for those of you who aren't familiar with CTTI and their work, I would really encourage you after this to go to their website. We have found their materials to be invaluable. Lots of practical information, lots of helpful information that we have found valuable in training our investigators, IRB members, and others. And we're excited to hear what they're going to share with us now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here with my colleague Michele, and I've asked Michele to start coughing loudly when my time is up to make sure that I don't go over. So the way this will be organized is I'll talk for the first half of this presentation, about 20 minutes, and then I'll ask Michele to step up. Thank you for those kind introductions. We work with Citi. We're not employees of Citi, so that's a little bit of a caveat, yet we're here to discuss some of the things that we've learned through our work at this advisory group. And I'll explain a little bit more of the background. But perhaps the most important thing I can mention about my colleague is that she's here on her birthday, and so that's a very kind sacrifice that you've made to be with us. Let's see, can we move this ahead? Great. So today, wonderful sequencing here. So from Dr. Al-Zarad from the FDA who just finished talked about data, use of data in various forms. And you heard the overview of some of the benefits of using real-world data, and we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive in mobile clinical trials. And I very much appreciate some of the questions that were brought up. There really are legitimate questions about who owns data, how is data generated. In some sense, we are all participants in the healthcare data, in the health data that's being generated and sold on kind of a marketplace that exists both at the research level, which is perhaps the light side, but also the industry level to sell pharmaceutical products, which is perhaps a bit of a darker side. I work on both sides. I teach at a university, but I also work at a CRO that's engaged with pharmaceutical companies. And I think it's appropriate to continue to ask these questions. Where is this data coming from? How is it being used? Now, that being said, I want to bring very much a sense of hope and optimism to this specific point about mobile trials, but in general about the use of data and technology. We need to make sure that the legislation is in place and that checks and balances are in place, but in general, I'm on the side that this is going to make healthcare better for various reasons that hopefully will show up in these slides, but mainly because it will empower patients through information, through utilization of their information, and really engage us in a way that we're no longer patients, but we're really the consumers of healthcare. and that we're much more proactive in the decisions that take place. And some of the background evidence is really being generated that this sea of data, of healthcare data that exists, is actually being utilized in appropriate ways. I mean, granted, there's a profit motive in some cases, but it also being utilized in an appropriate way that will level the playing field, and ultimately the power will shift to consumers and patients to be more engaged with their health care in a more fundamental way. All right, so enough proselytizing, let's move on. Despite the fact that we're talking about city recommendations, we're not employees of city, so that's just a little bit of a disclaimer. What is city, and what's the motivation behind city? Well, let me start with that. There is a sense that clinical trials and clinical development is somewhat in crisis, mainly because of the expense that goes into developing drugs. You probably are familiar with the latest data from the Tufts Center that it's somewhere around $2.5 billion for a small molecule to go all the way from discovery through approval. The success rate or the failure rate of getting a drug approved despite concluding phase 3 trials is still 50%. So the expenses are enormously high and unsustainable, and the ability to recruit patients into clinical trials is dismal. The global rate of recruitment is somewhere about half a patient per center per month, which means some centers do better than that, but a lot of centers do far worse than that, and a lot of centers do zero recruiting of patients. Why does that matter? Because it makes it expensive, but also gives us very non-representative samples of the patients that we're trying to, or of the people that we're trying to enroll, wind up being non-representative of the general population, and only select patients. This is another too infrequently discussed issue of clinical trials, that there are very much ethnic, economic, and racial biases in clinical development. All of these things are unsustainable for the future of drug development. So CITI recognizing these issues. CITI is an organization that came together to help advise the regulatory agencies, industry, and patients on potentially a path forward. One of these initiatives is around mobile clinical trials. And let me again start with, what are the potential benefits of mobile clinical trials? Some of these were discussed by Dr. Al-Zarad previously, but I think it all comes down to that first point, patient centricity. Making it easier to engage patients, making it easier to get data, better participation, level the playing field, a more representative sample of the population, and which in turn should lead to better efficacy data and better efficiency. So efficiency here is cost reduction. I mean, who could argue with this? Better, faster, cheaper. But in a way, the benefit that comes out of it should be thought of how this impacts us as patient consumers. And a little bit more specifically, the key findings. So I'm going to just kind of jump to the results at the end, at the beginning. The key findings from the project that CITI has sponsored are summarized here. The potential benefits include capturing previously unavailable data, objective data, real-world data from patients in their daily lives, a more representative sample population, reducing the barriers to participation, and lower costs. And a lot of things need to come together in order to make this a reality in the ultimate vision that we have. And we're at a starting point right now. There haven't been many of these types of trials that have been done. Michele will talk a little bit more about the Apple Heart study, whose results were just announced at the AAC recently. But it's something that we should be very excited about. I mean, that's a study that enrolled 400,000 patients, subjects, in something like 8 months. And for those of us in drug development or enrolling clinical trials, can you imagine enrolling 400,000 patients with essentially no advertising, essentially no sites, and it was in fact a larger number than that. They had to turn people away. So of course the industry is paying attention of how this can be brought to bear on drug development in general. And again, I think we should be careful, but I think we should be cautiously optimistic about what these trends mean. So the objective of this particular project at Citi was to look a little bit more closely and provide some specific recommendations around 3 components of mobile clinical trials: recommendations to the sponsor, recommendations to the sites, and then ethics IRB considerations. So this talk is broken up really into these 3 categories. All right, but let me step back for a second and just talk about Citi. So Citi is the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative. It's funded by the Duke Margulis Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization, foundation associated with Duke University, and it's also co-funded by the FDA with the objective of bringing industry, academia, patients, and regulators together to provide recommendations to transform clinical trials based on the observation that it's just unsustainable. There's a number of programs that exist within the Citi framework. On the lower left is the clinical trials. There's also work being done on real-world evidence and some of the things that were in the previous talk about discontinuous clinical trials, et cetera, but also quality initiatives, patient engagement, et cetera, et cetera. And the clinical trial program has got several pieces to it, looking at endpoints, technology, decentralization, and also engaging patients. And these considerations were brought together in recommendations to those 3 groups. And we have to think about the common themes as these recommendations come together. The goal here is engaging all stakeholders. Again, think of the way I think about this is a better representation of the population. One of the key findings, and this is probably the biggest take-home message, is that planning is very important in conducting these trials, as well as communication and training. Let me now talk about the some specific recommendations to the sponsor investigator. Now, the sponsor, whether it's an industry sponsor or an academic sponsor, but this is, in terms of the thought process for the design and conduct of the clinical trial. And there's 6 areas that the Citi recommendations are focused on. And by the way, these slides are available, but more importantly, Citi's got a nice website where all of these things are downloadable and go into much greater detail on the background and specific recommendations and various white papers coming out of this. But these are the 6 areas that I'll just touch on briefly going forward. Planning is critical. So, I think it was Eisenhower that said, plans are useless, but planning is the important part. There are multiple areas that should be thought about in considering the plan. Personally, I think selecting the right outcome at the very beginning is the key to success in everything that will happen in a mobile trial. Not just, certainly, every trial is in general, but in mobile clinical trials, the selection of the endpoint and thinking through the outcome that needs to be determined needs to be thought through very carefully, because the data is different. The way the data is collected can be different. Certainly we can do it kind of same old, but the opportunity to collect data and create novel endpoints is really quite fascinating. We're moving to an era where, and I'm already talking about this, we're moving to an era where we can start using continuous data as opposed to point data to determine the efficacy of various interventions and to really understand disease processes. We almost have to develop a new science to understand that. The amount of data that can be generated and the longitudinal nature of that data will be transformative for the way we understand disease, but we have to develop the statistics and the science behind it, as well as the outcome measures that go along with it. Many of us bemoan sort of the old endpoints that are frequently used. I won't name names here, but the endpoints that we feel that we're stuck with. Yet, as an industry, we seem to hesitate to develop new endpoints, which requires a lot of work. But it goes back to the planning, planning these trials ahead and thinking, well, if we have a continuous heart measurement, how can we use that to look at AFib, and what is that? What are the implications of that? There was some noise in the press that the outcome of the Apple Heart study was that it demonstrated merely a 0.4% capture rate for AFib, which led to a 70% positive predictive value. And some in the press said, well, that's really disappointing results. But that's really a very limited perspective based on the previous way of analyzing point data. We've got continuous data, a completely different data set that allows us to really think about capturing a much vaster group of patients and look at the continuity of their health and disease experience. Everything else is sort of the nuts and bolts of getting these trials done. The mobile technology selection is critical, but the strong recommendation from the participants and the advisor in this group is that the study should not be driven by the technology. The outcome should not be driven by the technology, but the other way around. The determination, the question should be asked first, and then technology should be selected to support those questions that we want to find, and engaging participants in the sites is critical. As part of the planning process, conducting feasibility studies is another critical step here. And these feasibility studies then go back to inform some of the things listed here around the tolerability, acceptability, and usability of the particular device, as well as some of the things that were discussed previously around the acceptability of the data that's being collected. The audit trail needs to be determined, and there's many points that these things can start falling apart that really should be discoverable in feasibility trials. Data security, of course, is a critical question that needs to be very closely examined in combination with the provider of the technology, the source holding on to the data, as well as the sponsor. And the manufacturer should be engaged, of course, to determine that they can provide these things. Are you not coughing yet?
You've got 5 more minutes.
Oh my gosh. So let me shift over to, these are considerations for the sites themselves. Similar but somewhat different, because it sort of raises the question that was discussed. If we're running a mobile clinical trial, or what they call a virtual clinical trial, what is a site? Who is a site? If we have thousands of participants who are at home, and perhaps they never show up at a hospital or a clinic. What is the site? Now, what the reaction from regulators was there has to be it was a pretty simple recommendation. We need a name, a physical address, and somebody to contact. So there is accountability. There has to be a trail of accountability for the collection of this data. And even in this mobile setting, even in this virtual setting, there is a distributed number of local sites, even if it's not the kind of sites that we think of for traditional trials. And so these are the things that some of the categories that we talk about, and just to touch on them briefly. Again, planning for site success is critical, making sure the infrastructure is there, the training has been conducted. Training, we talked yesterday about training and streamlining training, and also that the policies are in place to handle data. Again, staff training is critical, and part of the reason that staff training is critical is because when questions come up, who are you going to call? So by far, the trial staff and the sites tend to be the places called. Who's the help desk here? It tends to be the most local point of contact. So training is critical in making sure that these things are addressed. Budget considerations are critical, even in the world of these mobile trials. Should be thought through carefully. All right. Well, maybe I'll cough myself because I think I'm done. All right. Thank you.
Thanks. This is the problem with being short. I don't know if you cannot see me, but I'm here. So first, I want to thank Greg for his lead up to my part, which is on the IRB review and the ethics considerations. And just note again that our two presentations are on behalf of CTTI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And so I think both of us have a lot that we could say about mobile clinical trials and digital technology, but we're kind of staying within some of the boundaries that were created for us. Nope, let's go that way. So Greg mentioned the Apple Heart Study. So the Apple Heart Study was launched in November of 2017. Advarra is the IRB of record for the Apple Heart Study. It is and was a collaboration with Stanford University and Apple, and as Greg mentioned, it was really amazing what happened in this study. So it enrolled 400,000 participants from 50 states in 8 months, and so take a minute and think to yourself, how is this done? This was done with 400,000 people who wore Apple Watches, who downloaded an app. There's not 400,000 sites. There's not even 5 sites. There's just the Apple Watch. So it really changed, our conception when you're thinking about IRB review of where the research is being conducted. So the basics of the Apple Heart Study really were that if an irregular heart rhythm was identified by the Apple Watch, participants would receive a notification. They'd get a telehealth consultation with a doctor and an ECG patch if it was necessitated. And the study results, which were just released this March, so this is April, so the timing couldn't have been better, showed a 0.5% received an irregular heart notification. And so when you think about the value of people being able to gain this information and then act on it, it's really quite mind-boggling. So at CTTI, in the course of many, many meetings on mobile technologies, we discussed 6 major topics relating to IRB review in these mobile technologies. That participants needed to be advised of what's the technology, data privacy and confidentiality issues, and there have been a couple questions here this morning on privacy and confidentiality and mobile technologies, and I'm going to try to address them. Data access, who has access to the information and will it be commercialized? Is the information going to be shared back to participants and to their providers? What kind of safety monitoring is in place? And this technical support issue that Greg mentioned earlier, I have to say that this was an amazing thing to me. Participating in CTTI was of great value because we could sit in our IRB world, we could look at the protocol and the consent, and we might not really understand that there's an incredible need for technology and support when you're talking about research involving mobile technologies, and listening to the investigators talk about how much time this was taking them, and you know, how important it was to identify what are the potential issues and who's going to be responsive was a very eye-opening experience. So do not do pay attention to this issue of technology and support. So privacy and confidentiality, this was raised this morning. So, you know, Karen made a comment about being concerned about how she doesn't use her iPhone that much, and, you know, what do you do about all these technologies out there? I've gotten so paranoid that I went and bought myself a new scale, and I was terrified to fill out the warranty card because I thought if I sent it in with my name and I mean, it wasn't research, but if I sent it in with my name and address, did that mean that they could, you know, kind of activate a location activator in my scale and see how much I weighed? But, you know, I mean, clearly what you're looking at with mobile technologies, I mean, think about the Apple Heart Study, 400,000 people. Think about the amount of data. You know, you're talking about needing research teams that have access to the skills and expertise to be able to analyze that kind of data. And I think that that's something new for us. And then we have these issues with a mobile technology, which is that it can capture incidental data, so it could capture other information about a person besides what the objective of the research is, and it can also capture something that we call bystander data. So raise your hand if you have an Alexa or a Google Assistant at your house. Okay, so you stand there and you say, you know, like, turn the lights off or do whatever. I don't have one of these because I'm terrified of them. But imagine, and you know, it's probably going on today, imagine an asthma research study where, let's say somebody wants to use Alexa or the Google Assistant. Let's say I have asthma. I'm going to sign up for this, and they're going to put it in my house, right? And so what the role of that monitoring device is to listen to my cough, okay? But what happens if Greg walks in? And what happens if Greg's got a cough and he starts coughing and it captures his information? Or what happens if people walk into the room and they start talking? You know, is the conversation being picked up by the device? So I actually did a little bit of research. You probably know, Greg is much more in the weeds in this than I am, but my little research told me that these devices, Google Assistant and Alexa, have these wake words, these trigger words, that said it still can collect data, but rest assured, there's instructions on how you can go and delete the data, which I gotta tell you, there's no possible way that I'm gonna understand how to delete the data off of anything that I have. So the other very important topic at these CTTI meetings was returning value to participants. So is there a plan to provide information back to people? Will they be getting real-time access to the data? You know, will information be provided to participants and their providers? And this is something that the IRB should be thinking about. Safety monitoring is really important, and safety monitoring comes up in so many different ways, so I like to say expect the unexpected. Or as a lawyer by training, you know, think about your worst case scenario, because trust me, it's going to happen. So first of all, you know, is the data that's being collected the data that you want? Are you collecting other data that you don't want? And is there a way to manage that, or is that necessarily going to happen? If your mobile technology involves things called alerts or notifications or this or that, what happens if they stop working? Do you have some kind of monitoring to make sure that once you rolled out your mobile app to 400,000 people, it's actually doing what you think it's going to do? So there are lots of important reasons why you want to have why you want to have safety monitoring in this, just the way we have safety monitoring and a safety focus in everything else. And then another thing that was discussed at the CTTI meeting was to manage expectations. So if you're a participant in a research protocol, and it is something, I'm going to use the Apple Heart Study because it's easy, you know, it's looking at heart arrhythmias, you know, and AFib. How is that going to affect your sense of what your responsibilities are as a participant? So let me go to a different example. Let's say there's a research protocol and it's looking at an investigational drug for Parkinson's, and as part of the trial, there's a mobile technology that you can download on your phone, and it's going to measure your tremor. And let's say that you're taking the investigational agent, and this app records a significant increase in tremor, right? So what happens next? I mean, you need to be absolutely clear as an investigator, you know, are you giving a notification to the participant, and does the participant understand that there may be circumstances under which they need to call you or call their provider, and that needs to be very clear. So in terms of informed consent, let's talk about how you get that, or what that is. So when you're talking about the Apple Heart Study, the consent was embedded in the app. And of course, you know, there's lots of questions about if you embed a consent in an app, you know, is it capable of being revised? Because as we all know in the IRB world, you know, revision is, you know, something that always happens more times than you want to. Can consent be waived? And is there a written paper consent only? So when might you see that? So you could have a research protocol that's looking at a new kind of device, a cardiac stent, but maybe there's a mobile technology embedded in it where it's measuring heart rate just as an embedded part of the research. You're not likely to see the consent as part of the app. You're more likely in that case to see the consent, you know, again in the traditional paper form. So there is criteria to waive informed consent. I have to tell you, we review a lot of mobile app research. We've never, I don't know that we've ever waived consent, but if you're going to, you have to make sure it's minimal risk research. FDA now accepts waiver of consent following the HHS regulations, except for the fourth bullet down, which is the new criteria from the revised regulations, that research involves using identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens and so on. And then as an IRB, if you're looking at research involving mobile apps, you know, could the research be expedited or does it need to go to the full board? And this is just a note to remind everybody that FDA says that the non-significant risk, significant risk determination should be made by the convened full board IRB. So here we are back to the support and training topic, and let me go to an example. So you have a study in which participants are asked to report their mood via a survey app that reminds participants to complete a survey every 3 hours. That would drive me nuts, but anyway. The researchers start seeing a negative impact on participants who are monitoring their moods so often. The researchers would like to stop the study. However, the mobile apps keep reminding participants to complete a survey. I mean, this can be really a dangerous situation, you know. I mean, you have to evaluate in your review. The investigators have to, you know, anticipate, can they, you know, if somebody wants to withdraw from a study, how is that going to happen? If they need to immediately change something that's going on, like these 3-hour alerts, can they do it, and how are they going to do it? What happens if, you know, a participant has their app downloaded on an iPhone and their iPhone dies and then they have to go out and get a new one, and how do they transfer the app over? I mean, these are only some of the painful questions that come up when you're dealing with mobile technologies. So when you're an IRB and you're reviewing mobile technology, you know, you always have to start off, as usual, with any of the research we review by thinking about, you know, what are the appropriate regulations? Is it FDA regulated? FDA actually does exercise enforcement discretion over a significant number of mobile apps. Is there federal funding? And if it's not subject to FDA regulations and there's no federal funding, you really ought to have some criteria that you're using to review it. There's a real range of mobile apps. There's Fitbits, blood pressure monitors. There are apps now that regulate insulin pumps. There's standalone apps. There's apps that are part of clinical trials. So the next 3 slides actually, and you know, you have access to these slides, and I'm not going to, you know, read them in depth, but the next 3 slides identify 12 points, and they're not the only points, that you as an IRB should think about when you're reviewing research involving digital technology. So what's the use of the app in the research? And that actually can be a struggle to figure out whether the researchers are trying to validate the app or do something else with it. Is it to collect, store, or transmit participant data, provide logistical support? And who's the user population? Is it only individuals who own iPhones or Apple Watches or Androids? Is it only individuals of a certain range? You know, we actually had a research protocol come in based on a mobile app, and the participant population were people who were 70 and above, and you know, we kind of were like, well, this seems a little complicated, and do you think, and I mean, look, I'm getting older there too. This is, like I've been celebrating my 39th birthday for decades now. And, you really have to be aware of who is the population and how complicated is this app that they're asking people to use. Does the app require use of a specific device? So, if I use the Apple, if I participate in the Apple Heart Study, are they giving me an Apple Watch? And if they give me an Apple Watch, do I have to give the Apple Watch back? And if I do, what are the logistics of that? And if I have to provide my own Apple Watch, what happens if something goes wrong with it? What happens if the app freezes? Who's going to actually fix it? Whose responsibility is that? Is the use of the app mandatory or optional? And the next one, 5, this is a real problem I see. Is it a custom-made app? And if it's a custom-made app, how do you as an IRB know that the app is reliable and that it does what they say it's supposed to do? And what you need to make this determination is information about functionality, compatibility, performance, stability, and security. And I'll bet you that most of our IRBs don't routinely have people with this kind of expertise on the panels. And so if you're going to review research involving mobile technologies, make sure you have access to that expertise. Like the mood study, the mood survey, if somebody withdraws, how are we going to make sure this happens? And this is a really big issue, and this is something I'm going to talk about in a little more detail, but are participants required to agree to any end-user agreements, license agreements, terms of use, or privacy policies in order to download or access the app? And we'll get to that in a minute. Who has access to data collected by the app, because sometimes these devices, these end-user license agreements actually say that anything you download on the device is fair game for the device owner. What are the risks of the app not working as intended? What support's available? And does the app capture incidental data? So what should the IRB focus on? The IRB should focus on what it, should make sure, first of all, that it has enough information. Sorry, I just want to find this one piece of paper here. Make sure it has enough information to make the regulatory determinations. So let's go to end user agreements. So raise your hand here if you have a Fitbit. Okay, so raise your hand if you have a Fitbit and you read the click-through agreement. Okay, so here's what you didn't read when you didn't read the click-through agreement on your Fitbit. We use the information we collect to improve and personalize the services and to develop new ones. For example, we use the information to troubleshoot and protect against errors. So far, I'm okay with this. Perform data analysis and testing, conduct research and surveys, and develop new features and services. So when you started to use your Fitbit, you agreed that Fitbit could take all your data about your sleep and your steps or whatever else, is recorded on the Fitbit and use it for research purposes. And that's all you were told. So that's your end user license agreement, and then there's usually a privacy policy as well. Now, somebody wants to do research involving a Fitbit, and they say, well, you already have to have a Fitbit in order to participate in this research. Right? Well, so now you got this end user license agreement that you agreed to that has different words in it about privacy and confidentiality and access to data, may even have exculpatory language in it, and it isn't consistent with the informed consent that you're being asked to sign or agree to with respect to the research you're going to participate in that requires use of the Fitbit. So there's 4 slides here that you can read through in more detail about the end user license agreements and privacy policies in terms of use. But the consensus was at the CTTI meetings that because these are participant impacting materials, they should be reviewed by the IRB. I can't point to anything that says that they have to be reviewed by the IRB, but as a matter of best practice, I think that they should be. You need to know what's in them that might conflict and impact a participant who's enrolled in mobile technology research. At the very least, I think you have an obligation to make sure the consent discloses to people what the issues are for privacy and confidentiality, the fact that there may be other people outside the research who have access to your data. If you get a custom app to review, you may actually be able to have the terms of use and the privacy policy changed, because that is something that may be owned and managed by the researcher. So that's less of an issue than if you're dealing with an app that's being downloaded on an iPad, iPhone, Android, or whatever. So let's go for a minute to unexpected issues. So go back to the Apple Heart Study, which is providing notifications. So what happens if those notifications don't work? And this is where, again, I say expect the unexpected. So now you go, the notification doesn't work, or let's say the notification works, but people aren't contacting the teledoc. What do? And the researcher says to you, well, I want to pick up the phone and I want to call people. Well, if your protocol and your consent didn't say that people were going to get phone calls or they weren't going to get emails, you know, you have to bring it back to the IRB, and you got to consider whether that's acceptable, given what was approved by the IRB and what participants are expecting. So a lot of this has to do with thinking about what you don't think will likely happen and managing participant expectations. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is selection of subjects. What's the language of the app? I think most of these are in English, so you're limiting populations that don't speak English. Is written consent an alternative? And how do you actually confirm who's enrolling in the research? So, you know, if I enroll in research using a mobile app, is it really me? Is it a minor? You know, is it a prisoner? Is it someone who's cognitively impaired? Is it my dog? You need to have some verification procedures. So just to sum up the CTTI Mobile Clinical Trials Program, I think it's an incredibly valuable effort. I think that a lot of what they do is really good, and I encourage you to go to the website. You know, as Greg said earlier, you know, because he mentioned the conclusions of the group at the outset, the group was very positive about incorporating mobile technology into clinical trials, but that you need to do an enormous amount of upfront planning to make it successful, that when you have input from all the different stakeholders, that you're likely to see more benefits and success, and that on the one hand, you might feel that the mobile technology is more expensive, but if you look at how many people were enrolled in such a short time with the Apple Heart Study, you can see that there can be enormous benefits. So that wraps up the presentation. I want to thank everybody on behalf of Greg and myself.